Hey crew, as you can see, coming to you from a new venue today. This one happens to be approximately a 90-degree turn from our old venue, but we got to keep things fresh somehow. So as we get rolling today, I just want to draw your all's attention to one particular facet of NEOBC Youth Live that I just want you all to be more aware is available to you, and that is our take-home materials section. So if you go to the website, NEOBC Youth Live, the website, and again, you can find that on the About page of this YouTube channel. You will see a tab for take home materials, and what you'll find there are family discussion guides for our BFG lessons, like this one, that include a summary of our lesson along with some questions to talk about with your family. And those happen to be the same questions that we will be discussing in our small groups when we do our hangouts. And so if you want to get a jump start on thinking about those, just chatting about them with your family, those will be available to you there. And also our C group summaries, and they're pretty much the same format. You'll get a summary of the C group lesson along with the same discussion questions we're going to be using during our hangout time. So again, if you just want something to help you get a quick refresher on what we covered and be thinking about the questions that we will ask as a group during our hangouts, those are available for you. So transitioning now to our teaching time, our going through the Bible, we are continuing in the book of Judges. And today we are coming to Judges chapters 6 and 7. And just to spend a quick second to kind of recap what's been going on in Judges, I want to take us back to the beginning and then just look at where we've stopped along the way. So at the beginning of the book of Judges, we were kind of brought to this point in the story of Israel where Joshua had died, and the whole generation that went into Israel died along with him. And we were told that once that happened, once that generation passed away, Israel turned to idolatry. They stopped worshiping God and started worshiping idols. And we saw how God sometimes uses painful consequences to draw his people back. He did that to Israel then, and he does that to us now. Then we were introduced to these people called judges. And we noticed that in the book of Judges, Israel goes through this cycle where they'll turn away from God. God will introduce painful consequences. Then God will raise up a leader and a rescuer called a judge who rescues Israel out of those painful consequences and leads them back into a right relationship with him. And what we were told at the beginning is this becomes a cycle where Israel goes into idolatry over and over again, and God has to raise up judge after judge after judge. And so last week we got our first taste of that with Deborah and Barak, where Deborah was this judge who was leading Barak, the leader of Israel's army, to act faithfully and to attack Israel's army, our enemies, the way God had instructed him to. And the takeaway from that lesson was that when God's people are all fulfilling their roles, then God grants them victory over the enemy. And for us, we saw that our enemy is not flesh and blood, according to Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, but the forces of darkness and Satan. Now, the wheel is turned again. We've moved past Deborah and Barak. Israel has fallen back into idolatry. They've suffered more painful consequences, and it's time once again for God to raise up a leader and a judge to rescue Israel and lead them back into a right relationship with him. So pick up with me in Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 12. And the first observation I want us to take away from the passage today is this: God used a weak army and a weak leader to deliver his people. God used a weak army and a weak leader to deliver his people. So I'm going to read two chunks of scripture. I'll make a few comments in between them. But to start us out, we're going to be in Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 16. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, appeared to Gideon and said, "The Lord is with you, valiant warrior. Gideon said to him, "Please, my lord, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? And where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about? They said, 'Hasn't the Lord brought us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in strength. Go in the strength you have and deliver Israel from the grasp of Midian. I am sending you." He said to him, "Please, Lord, how can I deliver Israel? Look, my family is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. But I will be with you," the Lord said to him. "You will strike Midian down as if it were one man." So here's what I'd like us to note about Gideon is that Gideon was a hesitant leader. That is, when God called Gideon to action, when he appeared to him as a man, as an angel sitting under a tree, and summoned him to act and to lead Israel, Gideon did not respond with boldness and courage and faithfulness and zeal. Gideon responded with doubt and hesitation and weakness. And in many ways, I think what this highlights for us is that Gideon was simply not a strong leader. Gideon was, in fact, a weak leader, a hesitant leader. You know, as I was reading this, I couldn't help but contrast him in my mind to maybe the greatest leader of all time, which is Captain America. And you all will recall with me, those of you who have seen it, that Captain America, particularly in that first Avengers movie, he is a bold, decisive, inspiring, fervent leader of action who is willing to face adversity, drive head on into it, and act decisively. And he really inspires and brings along the rest of his followers into whatever situation they're going in. And that's what a strong leader looks like. But that's very different from what we get with Gideon. And in many ways, Gideon acts as the opposite. And so there we get that component of our first observation that Israel is about to go into combat, not with a bold, zealous, strong leader like Captain America, but with a weak and hesitant man named Gideon. But the situation gets worse for them, and we'll pick up in chapter 7, verses 8 through 9, to see a little bit more of what God has in store. So read with me. "The Lord said to Gideon, 'I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped and hand the Midianites over to you. But everyone else is to go home.' So Gideon sent all the Israelites to their tents, but kept 300 troops, who took the provisions and their trumpets. The camp of Midian was below him in the valley." So a little bit of context of what's happening here. When Gideon summons Israel and he gathers up the army, we're told that somewhere around 32,000 men show up to do combat. But God says to Gideon, that army is too big. It's too strong. It's too mighty. So God starts to introduce a couple of tests to winnow down the size of Israel's army. And one of the tests he introduces is he has the army stop by a body of water and tells the men to drink. And he says, whoever drinks of the water and laps it up like you would see a dog lap it up, whoever drinks the water that way, they're going to be my army. Everybody else go home. And by the time it's done, we have moved from an army of over 30,000 men down to an army of 300. And once we have the army of 300, that's when God says, okay, now you can attack. So notice with me what we've got. We started this story by being introduced to Gideon, who was summoned by God to be a leader, and showed himself to be a very weak, indecisive leader. And then we were introduced to Israel's army, which started as a grand, mighty army, but God winnowed down to a weak and feeble army. And it was with this army that God defeated the Midianites. We won't read the story now, but if you keep reading through chapter 7, what you will find is that Gideon and the army of the 300 did attack their enemy, and they did have success. And Gideon freed the people of Israel from underneath the reign of the Midianites. So that's the first observation. God used a weak army and a weak leader to deliver his people. But here's the second thing I want us to see. God was glorified by granting victory to a weak leader with a weak army. God was glorified by granting victory to a weak leader with a weak army. Rewind just a few verses with me in chapter 7, and let's pick up in verse 2, where the Lord explains to Gideon why it is that he chose to take an army of 30,000 and winnow it down to an army of 300. He writes, "The Lord said to Gideon, 'You have too many troops for me to hand the Midianites over to them, or else Israel might elevate themselves over me and say, my own strength saved me.'" In other words, God explains to Gideon that the reason for reducing the size of Israel's army was that Israel's army was too mighty for it to be clear that God was the one granting them the victory. And to illustrate this principle that I think God is using in this line of reasoning, I want you to think of a couple examples with me. So first off, think of artist for a second. You know, I'm terrible at artistry of any sort, as any of you who have ever seen me draw on a whiteboard are very aware of. But I do love to look at masterful art, the kind of art that people produce who are very skilled at it. You know, it's one thing to have somebody who's an artist who can walk into a studio where they have all kinds of equipment, all the finest brushes and pens and pastels and paper and canvases and all those materials that go into that craft. It's one thing for somebody to walk into a studio like that and make a masterful piece of art, and that is impressive. But you know what's more impressive? Is somebody who can reach under a couch, pull out a busted up, half-sharpened pencil, and take out a piece of plain notebook paper and make something beautiful and masterful on that. And I think what we recognize intuitively in that contrast is that what makes the latter more impressive is that when somebody can accomplish something with a broken tool or in adverse circumstances, it highlights their own skill and ability. To give you another example, I'm going to use Tiger Woods. So obviously Tiger Woods, not the historically, not the all-around best guy, had some dark things happen in his past, but that aside, still recognized as one of the best athletes ever to live. And for those of you who may not know Tiger Woods is considered to be one of the greatest golfers of all time. And in 2008, Tiger Woods won the US Open, which is a major golf tournament. But what made that year particularly impressive was that not only did Tiger Woods win, he won having broken his leg 2 weeks prior. And I think what makes that victory even more impressive than if he had just won it is that he was able to accomplish something with a broken tool, namely a broken body, and in adverse circumstances. And that just highlighted all the more how skillful and capable he was as a golfer. I think in the same way, it's one thing for God to grant the victory to Israel when they have a mighty army with a mighty leader. But when God does it with a weak leader and a weak army, it highlights all the more his power and ability in the situation. Because it's clear in that situation that Gideon was not a strong enough leader to lead an army to victory. And 300 men was not a big enough army to defeat the Midianites. But when God stepped in, through his power and his ability, he was able to use that weak tool to accomplish his goal. And that glorifies him all the more. So those are our first two observations. And here's the takeaway for us today. God sometimes uses weak people to accomplish big goals for his glory. God sometimes uses weak people to accomplish big goals for his glory. You know what God did there with Gideon and the Israelites attacking the Midianites and him using those that weak implement to win victory for his people. That is a pattern we see throughout Scripture, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, of God using weak people to accomplish big goals in order to highlight the fact that he is the one empowering the weak people to bring about the goals that he has in mind. And I think what was true with Gideon and the Israelites is true with us today. That sometimes God uses the weak people to do big things. So it's clear to them and to the world that he is the one at work. With that said, I'd like now to bring out just three implications of that point. Three ways that I think that truth, that God sometimes uses weak people to accomplish big goals for his glory, three ways that truth can impact our lives. And here's the first one. I think that gives us hope when we feel inadequate. You know, if you're like me, there are times in your life where you feel inadequate to do what you believe God is calling you to do. And that's certainly true for me. I know it's true for many others that I am close with. And I'm willing to bet for at least some of you, if you're honest with yourselves right now, it's true for you as well. And this can look many different ways. I think one place it comes up often is when we try to share the gospel with friends and family, or even strangers that we meet, where we begin that process and the thought enters our mind of maybe this is the time for me to share the gospel, and then that knot wells up in our stomach, and all of a sudden this heavy weight falls upon us, and we think to ourselves, I'm not up for this. I can't do this. This is beyond me. You know, maybe another time is you're in the youth ministry and you see somebody off to the side and you think, man, maybe I need to engage them. Maybe there's somebody that just looks sad that day. Maybe they're a guest. Maybe there's someone you know who's not as connected, and the thought enters your mind, you know, the godly thing to do in this moment, the right thing to do would be for me to reach out to that person, and that same weight falls upon your shoulders and penetrates into your heart, and you think, I'm just not up to that. I'm not a people person. I don't know what to say. I'm not up for this. Or maybe just to give a few more examples, there's a particular sin in your life, a sin that you do regularly. It's habitual. And try as you might, you just never seem to break free of it. And it feels like no matter what you do, this sin just has a hold on you and you'll never be free. Or maybe, to give one final example, it's just you're trying to love somebody that's hard to love, someone that hurts when you try to love them. But you believe God is calling you to love that person in some way, and you think to yourself, or you feel in your heart, I just can't be civil and kind to this person in any way because of the way they treat me and the way they've hurted me. I think in all of those scenarios, we can have hope, because this is the truth of the matter. That when we face situations like those, where we feel inadequate, and maybe we are inadequate, often those are the times that God chooses to grant victory. Not because we're strong, but precisely because we are weak, in order to make clear to us and to the world that He is the one granting the victory. Number 2, empowerment is different than acting. In other words, when God empowers somebody to do something, that is different than God doing it Himself. Notice, God could have miraculously and directly brought it about that the Midianite army was simply conquered. He does it Himself directly. And to give you an example of this, when Israel crosses the Red Sea, it's not as if Moses was out there with a bucket parting the sea one load of water at a time. No, instead, God split the sea open directly. God did it Himself. But that's not what happens in the story of Gideon and the Israelites. In that story, God works through Gideon and through the Israelites. He supernaturally empowers them with the knowledge and ability to do something that is beyond them in that moment. And the reason I bring up this distinction is to say, when God empowers weak people to do big goals, the people still have to act. In other words, in those moments where we feel inadequate and we feel God is calling us to act, those are often the moments where God brings about victory. But He brings about victory when we have the faithfulness to act. And I do want to bring up the point to you as well that sometimes what looks to us like someone who's very strong in an area, very skilled in a particular area of ministry, and honestly, they might be strong and very skilled in that area of ministry. The truth of the matter is they may have gotten to that point simply by choosing to act faithfully time and time again, and find God empowering them time and time again until that divine empowerment resulted in them being stronger in that area. So that's the second thing. Empowering is different than acting. God does empower the weak, but when God empowers the weak, there is still this need for them to act. And sometimes, when they are faithful over a long enough period of time and they've been empowered by God each step of the way, that's when they begin to look more like skilled people in that area. And here's the third thing. Weak people in action is success. Weak people in action is success. That is, God called Gideon to act. He called Gideon and the Israelites to attack their enemy, the Midianites. And I submit to you that God was the one who provided the victory. Likewise, when God calls us to act, knowing that He is the one that's going to empower us, it is us acting that matters. And to put that a different way, think of it this way. What God is really calling His people to is to do certain things He has commanded them, to live a certain way that He has laid out for them. And whether or not that is successful is largely something that we leave to God. But what matters for us is that we have the faithfulness to act in that moment. And I think a great example of this is in the case of evangelism. You know, when you reach those moments where you feel led or burden to share the gospel with somebody, and that weight of inadequacy falls upon you, I think it's important to remember in those sorts of moments that what God is calling you to do is simply to act, to be a weak person who feels inadequate, but trust in Jesus enough to act faithfully and do what it is you know God is calling you to do. And whether or not that is successful is something that God will decide. But if we have the faithfulness and the courage to do what God has called us to do, that in and of itself is success. So I'll leave you guys with that. Please do, if you have the time and availability, be sure to check out our BFG Hangouts happening later on Sunday. That's 2 p.m. for the middle school and 3 p.m. for the high school. And you can find all the links for that on the NEOBC Youth Live website.